Embassy of the Dead, Chapter 19, Cora Sanderford. Jake kept low as he ran across the gardens towards the school. The moon shone high in the sky, silhouetting the building so it appeared as a giant black fortress looming up from the ground. The wind had picked up and Jake pulled his hoodie tight around his head, thankful for the howling that hid the sound of his feet as he crossed the gravel path leading to the front door. Not that he would be going in that way. He wasn't a total amateur, even if he'd never broken into a school before, or into anywhere for that matter. It wasn't the sort of thing Mum and Dad would approve of, and to be honest, it wasn't something he'd ever imagined himself doing either. Still, it wasn't every day you were threatened with the eternal void. He imagined the response he'd get from his mum if he used that excuse. "The Grim Reaper forced me to do it." Unsurprisingly, breaking into a school turned out to be quite difficult. The main windows were, of course, all locked. Jake toyed with the idea of smashing a brick through one of them, but he was secretly relieved that there was nothing in sight he could use to do such an obviously illegal thing. He skirted round the side wall towards the back of the building, once again keeping as low as possible. Eventually the school wall turned the corner, and there it was, his chance. A small window left ajar, just big enough for him to climb through and just within reach. Besides, it wasn't breaking in if he didn't break anything, was it? Cautiously looking around one last time, Jake jumped up, grabbed the bottom of the ledge and frantically scrabbled his feet up the wall until he could force his head through the gap. A row of toilet cubicles looked back at him. There he stayed for a moment, catching his breath, his bum sticking out in the cold and his hood clinging to his head, looking like the least professional ninja ever. He wriggled forward until his weight started to pull him down into the room. Then, with a ripping noise, he fell head first into the basin before tumbling to the floor. He lay motionless for a few seconds, panting heavily. So, what if it hadn't been the most graceful entrance? He'd done it! He was inside the school and there was no turning back. He smiled at the thought of Sab's face if he knew that his friend Jake was a dangerous criminal. The naughtiest thing Sab had ever done was copying an essay from the internet. Mr. Jelani, the English teacher, hadn't noticed. They had a theory that he just gave out random marks anyway. Jake wondered what kind of student Cora Sanderford had been. The thought of her wiped the smile off his face. Maybe she'd passed to the afterworld years ago, and all this was a waste of time. Maybe she'd turned into some kind of super evil poltergeist, if they even existed. Maybe he wouldn't be able to work out why she was trapped here at her old school on the earthly plane. Well, there was only one way to find out. He stood up, dusting himself off, and opened the door out of the toilets as quietly as he could, peeking into the dimly lit corridor. It was empty. He crept out into the long hallway and tiptoed down it, painfully aware of the sound of his footfalls, until he came to a pair of heavy double doors. They were more like the doors you'd see in an old castle than a school, ancient thick beams of wood held together by black studded metal bands. He had to use his whole body weight to push one open. That's when he noticed the chill. From the darkness of the doorway he could see he was in a grand assembly hall. The room was cavernous, at least 3 stories above his head. Huge wooden timbers spanned the vaulted ceiling, and the moonlight shone through large arched windows, revealing that half of the room was full of rows of tables and benches, all laid for breakfast. He jumped as his knee knocked against a trolley, rattling the cutlery and a tray of condiments in little packets. He picked up a sachet of ketchup and smiled to himself. It was the same cheap, vinegary brand they had at his school. It was funny that even at this posh school they couldn't stretch the budget to proper ketchup. He stood for a second and listened. Silence. He walked into the centre of the room. He wasn't even sure what he was listening for. Perhaps it should be the quiet and sporadic knocking he'd read about in the file. Jake looked around. The heavy door he'd entered through was closed. Had he pushed it shut? He couldn't remember. He took a deep breath to calm his nerves. He remembered the words in the file. No threat to the living. That's when he heard the knock. It was the kind of noise that you might have mistaken for the clanking of an old radiator or something. That's what a grown-up would have said, or someone who wasn't sensitive, perhaps. Maybe that's what sensitive meant, just being open, open to accepting that not everything had a logical or mundane explanation, open to being curious, open to questioning what a sound really was. Then the knock sounded again, louder this time. Jake felt it was coming from the other side of the stage. He slowly walked across the floor towards what seemed to be the source of the sound, a glass-fronted cabinet next to the stage. The cabinet contained trophies. They weren't like the ones in his school, tacky wooden shields, plastic cups, or badly moulded figures on fake marble plinths. These were real trophies, probably real gold and silver, Jake thought. He cast his eyes along the cabinet's shelves. He stopped. An inscription on a small silver trophy had caught his eye. "The Cora Sanderford Memorial Award for Sporting Excellence," he whispered. Cora Sanderford, his poltergeist! Rain started spattering at the windows. It hadn't looked stormy outside, but it was coming down hard now. Jake swallowed and looked round the room again. "Hello," he said quietly into the gloom. "Cora? I'm here to help you move on." He tried to sound confident, but his voice came out all weak and reedy, shaking with nerves. There was another knock, louder this time and closer too, so that Jake nearly jumped out of his skin. He tried to breathe and stay calm. No threat to the living. "Cora, is that you?" he tried again. He looked back at the silver trophy. He noticed that of all the trophies in the cabinet, this was the only one that wasn't straight. Jake pressed his hands against the glass and, finding it unlocked, slid the door open. He reached in and picked up the trophy. It was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. He flicked open the tiny lid, marvelling at its precise silver hinges. At first, the noise sounded like a breeze, a whispering sound that built, louder and louder still, rushing around his head until it was howling like a gale, forcing him to cover his ears. "I want to help you!" Jake shouted. His heart was racing and his legs felt like they were on the point of collapse. No threat to the living. There was a crack to the side of his head, not too hard, more like a slap, but enough to make him stagger to the side. No threat to the living. He spun round, but there was nobody there. He felt a wetness drip down his forehead and instinctively touched it with his fingers. No threat to the living. He looked at his hand. It was red. Blood red. That's when everything went black. Well, my goodness. Do you think Cora Sanderford is someone we should be worried about then?
Maybe.
Maybe.
I mean, it seems like she gave him a very, very, very hard slap.
Yeah, if it was a slap. Oh my goodness.
Because I don't know slaps giving people blood. And also when I was looking out the window, it was just a squirrel on the roof.
Okay, thanks. Well, we'll find out more about Cora Sanderford, or whoever the ghost is, in the next chapter, I guess.